I'm Mattea Roach, and welcome to Bookends. When someone like an artist or a musician or a writer really piques my interest, I will sometimes spend like a really long time, maybe several hours, just going down a Google rabbit hole trying to learn everything about them and their career. And that's kind of what happened when I was preparing for our next guest, Anne Fleming. I can now tell you, after my internet sleuthing, that Anne used to play the trombone, but fell in love with the ukulele later on. In Anne's words, she tans blotchily. Again, those are her words and not my words. At 9 years old, Anne was caught breaking into her school. And she worships homemade cassettes, which I would love to know more about. All of this is actually just on her website. I didn't really have to look hard for most of it. You can go read it as well. Anne's latest novel is called Curiosities, and it's been shortlisted for this year's Giller Prize. The story features a quasi-fictional Anne Fleming who, much like me, needs to know more about the people that she's fascinated by. Anne, the character, pieces together what happened to two girls living in 17th century England as they navigated their way to adulthood. The story that unfolds is a tale of witchcraft, forbidden love, and the very nature of truth itself. Anne Fleming joined me from the CBC studio in Victoria. Hi, Anne. How are you?
I'm great. I'm happy to be here.
I am so excited to be chatting with you because I loved reading Curiosities. It was like a fun little treasure for me to unwrap, I felt, as I was reading through it. In Curiosities, there's this fictional version of you, Anne Fleming, who frames the story. And you're kind of playing this role of an amateur historian who has happened upon 5 17th century manuscripts that are all connected through some common characters and events. Why did you want to insert yourself into the story in this way? Like, why not just do a sort of straight historical fiction novel where we're in the 17th century?
It's a great question. Part of it was a desire to bring the present into the past and to have them be in relationship with one another. And another part of it was sort of practical of like, what are the things that attach these or move between these different manuscripts, and how are they arranged in order to make the story unfold in a particular way with a particular experience for the reader. So, and there was also a little practical aspect of what it allowed me to do with uncertainty. Like, the story is fictional, but I tried to be as true as I thought I could be to elements of the past. And there is the truth that the past is unknowable. I mean, we can gather a lot of information and we can make a lot of inferences, but ultimately it's unknowable. And there was some element of that I wanted to retain, of its unknowability. Also, it was just fun to do. I really enjoyed doing it. It brought back a sense of playfulness to me as I was writing, which I feel playfulness helps me write, helps me get it done.
I'm wondering how much of this fictional Anne historian in the novel who's piecing together these manuscripts, how much of it is based on you and how much of it is just kind of that playful, you know what, I'm going to make this narrator character who's piecing together these manuscripts have this trait that's not like me, the real Anne Fleming?
It was very much me, but adjacent, me, but a little bit off. And there was something in a petty way entertaining for me about just making these tiny changes, like writing at the end of the preface. So I have this little preface, and then it says Anne Fleming, Vancouver. And I was in Victoria when I wrote Vancouver. And there was just something really entertaining to me to just change things a little bit in a way that actually wouldn't matter to anyone else at all. But people who know me and have read the book will ask me, wait a minute, did you actually do this? Or I didn't know you ever did that. And no, I made that part up. But otherwise, we're pretty much the same. Anne Fleming she's a bit more goofily overenthusiastic, I think. Maybe not. Ultimately, maybe I'm also goofily overenthusiastic. But when I wrote it, I thought I was being goofily overenthusiastic with the character.
Yeah, there's a sort of playfulness of these low-stakes lies, almost, yeah. It sounds like, where it's like there's absolutely no harm done by saying, well, I was in Vancouver when I found no, I was in Victoria, right? It's just like to be silly. I want to get into the meat of the story, though, because we learn about this fictional Anne Fleming through these sort of notes that are interspersed through the novel. But the bulk of the story is told through these 5 manuscripts that Anne has compiled together. And the story centers on Joan and Thomasina, who goes by Tom, who meet when they're very young children. The plague has killed most of their families and most of the people in the village around them, and they're left to fend for themselves. And I'm curious, the character Anne in your book doesn't know these girls. They're not part of her family. She has no skin in the game, so to speak. And yet there's this clear drive and desire to find out more about their lives. Why do you think that people have this drive sometimes to dive into history in this way and to dive specifically into the lives of these people that are not of great historical significance?
Well, that's the exact appeal. And it's the thing that is very, very hard to find or to know from the primary sources, from the written record that actually exists. And so it feels like a perfect thing for a novel to imagine the lives of these people whose lives mostly would not have been documented in any way or would have been documented in very small ways by birth and death records and marriage records, for instance. And I believe have valuable, important, significant lives. So, I mean, I did read a lot of, as many of the diaries I could find. Those were fascinating. And there is just this like absolute fascination with trying to imagine what it was like. Like that's kind of the appeal of writing fiction broadly is what was it like? What did that feel like? What were those tensions? What were those dynamics? What was it like to be alive in that space and time? So I just feel like that's innately fascinating.
I'm wondering, there's this explanation that we see in the novel where narrator Anne Fleming explains her specific interest in the 17th century as a period to dive into. There's these early high school influences that piqued Anne, your narrator's interest in history, and this idea of accessing history through the back door, through the stories of these people that are not the major players, as you say. What is it about the 1600s, 17th century England in particular that you found appealing as a ground for historical fiction?
Oh, there are so many things. There's just an entire suite of things that went together to create that pull. But a huge part of it was how often they were wrong and the ways in which they were wrong, and also the ways in which, in many ways, the 17th century is a bit of a hinge century between, it's called the early modern time in historical reckoning, and it has that feeling of like aspects of modernity that continue within European culture. I want to be specific about that it's not universal by any means. They learned things from observation. It was a period of a shift from relying on the authority of the ancients, of Greek and Roman writers that they had been unearthing in the Renaissance, and then moving from that authority to direct observation of life and drawing conclusions, gaining knowledge from seeing things happening. So that's a fascinating aspect to me, but also just these fabulous folk beliefs that, for instance, you can cure a thrush by putting a frog in a child's throat until the frog dies. And then you get another frog and you keep doing it. These weird mistakes or wrongnesses were charming to me on the one hand, but they also felt like there must be corollaries in contemporary knowledge. There was a certain kind of I can feel superior and laugh at their mistakes, but by the same token, I'm like, no, I want to not feel superior, but feel like we have a kinship and that there are probably things that culturally we believe now that later we will see as mistakes. So there's a kind of a humility in it as well. There are many, many other aspects of it that I find fascinating. The language alone. Then, of course, there's just witch trials that I've always been interested in the witch trials because, again, here's this massive mistake, this wrongheadedness that was a core central belief, including perhaps some of the people accused of witchcraft themselves may Some evidence suggests that they themselves believed that they were witches. Lots of people didn't, and we're very clear about that too. So anyway, those are just like a smattering of some of the things that I find interesting about the period.
There's so much to delve into in that answer. I think this idea of like looking back into the past and seeing this particular period of time where we in the 21st century can kind of sit back and say, like how ridiculous some of these things were that people thought and kind of laugh about it. But it was so incredibly serious to people who were living in those times. That was the world that they knew. And then what beliefs of ours are going to seem equally ridiculous, 4 centuries on is so interesting. We'll return to a lot of this stuff about the beliefs around witchcraft because I absolutely want to talk about it. But in terms of language, part of what really helped set the scene in this novel for me was how each manuscript was written in something that was kind of akin to the English that would have been used at the time that these documents were being produced in theory, so like early to mid 17th century. I could read and understand everything pretty easily, so I know it was like tweaked and altered for the modern reader, but the illusion of reading, authentic documents from that time really worked. What was it like for you as a writer to adopt that voice of an English of times gone by?
It was a total delight. I just really, really enjoyed it. I loved first of all, the variant spelling alone is perfectly charming and a wonderful kind of antidote to the rigidity of our current ideas about spelling. I love that a single author would spell the same word 3 different ways in the same document. Like they had no notion of consistency. So that was just idiosyncratic and likable in that sense. I also loved the word order. It's a bit more Germanic. Odd locutions that I found likable. Mostly they knew Latin. It's a very Latin-infused language, which I try to avoid it. I try to throw in a little bit here and there so it'd have this ring of authenticity, but not to use it too much because,
they're not teaching Latin in schools anymore.
They are not. Although I took a Latin course myself while writing this novel so that I could understand some of the primary sources.
Oh, wow.
Because so many of them were written in Latin. And, it helped me a little, I found it a difficult language.
I want to go back into the beginning of the novel. We see Joan and Tom, who again have been sort of abandoned a little bit and are alone as children during plague times. And they meet Old Nut, who's this older woman who lives in the woods. Old Nut takes the girls in. She forages for them. She keeps them safe in this hut in the forest. But when extended family members return to the village, Old Nut ends up being accused of witchcraft, and there's this whole kind of trial that she gets subjected to. I'm wondering if you can talk a bit more about the character of Old Nut, why she was such an easy target for a witch hunt, and what some of the common characteristics were of people who got accused of witchcraft during the period that you set this novel in.
You can summarize it in a way that I think most people would probably already have a sense of, that, often older women who are marginalized in some way, often widows, often poor women. And often it was people who asked things of their neighbors and asked and asked and asked. And, finally someone gets fed up and says, no, you can't have any more of this thing that you asked for, this beer or this yeast, you can't come begging here anymore. I'm fed up. And then the older woman would be angry and just show their anger in whatever way that came out. Sometimes it might be literally a curse. I curse you. Or it might just be, plain old anger. And then something befalls the person who has been yelled at, and they feel that it came from the woman. So Old Nut in specific, she lives a very literally marginal life in the sense that she's deaf, she can't hear, and while her father was physically abusive, she's deaf because he boxed her ears, and she has sort of cauliflower ears. And he dies when a tree falls on him and people think, oh, it's witchcraft. It's sort of the mother and Old Nut. So she's grown up in this impoverished family that already had a suspicion of witchcraft upon it. And she lives in the woods between 2 towns, and she gathers nuts and then tries to sell them door to door, essentially barter them. And you just are living by foraging mostly, and a little bit by petty theft, and a little bit by this barter kind of arrangement. And it all makes you quite vulnerable and susceptible to the generosity of others.
I'm wondering then, because this sort of very sincere belief in the devil and belief in witches that we see depicted in this novel and that we've also seen depicted in so many other works, like The Crucible comes to mind. I watched that Danish silent film documentary Haxan the other day about the history of witchcraft in Europe. That was sort of a document of it. People really bought into these things. We don't really have that same sort of belief in devils and witches anymore as a thing that a lot of people buy into. But the figure of the marginalized person who comes demanding, as you say, bread and ale or what have you, is certainly still, I would say, a bit of a boogeyman figure that we see used in culture. Do you have any thoughts, I'm wondering, about how this sort of figure or archetype of the witch or of this marginalized older woman has evolved over time?
Oh, that's a great question, and one that I haven't really thought about. Actually, I think you've kind of said it already in what you just said, in that one of the things that I found most difficult to wrap my head around was the belief in the devil. That was just fully something I've never believed in and found it difficult to believe in. But I had to understand what it felt like to be convinced that the devil is a person, a spirit, a being who can inhabit others and, has this incredible power. And also the flip side of that is that, if you believe in it fully, then you can really commit yourself to wanting to combat the devil. But I think one of the reasons is that anthropologically you might just talk about witch beliefs in the culture broadly are less about the devil and more about the power of the witch. But for the people who are prosecuting the witches, it's about the power of the devil and how the danger of how that influence might spread and take over an area or a state. But I think that kind of innate fear of the old, poor, ugly, and demanding is just powerfully enduring.
One of the other ways in which I felt this book was kind of a bit of a portal into some enduring beliefs that we still see, but they just manifest differently now, is some of the stuff around gender in this novel I found really fascinating. We have these two characters, as I mentioned, Joan and Tom. Tom is born a girl, but takes on the sort of name and identity of a man. She believes that her best chance at freedom and getting to live a self-actualized life is to become a boy. She swaps clothes with another young child who is actually also named Thomas, and eventually spends the rest of her days as a man from the age of, I think, about 11. She's quite young when she makes this decision. Now, this sounds a bit fantastical in terms of how she's able to carry it off, but was this fantastical? What did you find in the research that you did in writing this novel about women who lived as men? Or, obviously the way that we even talk about people who live as a gender other than what they're assigned at birth is totally different now than how it was then.
Yeah, exactly. And I think I tried to not over-prescribe or ascribe identity into Tom's situation, but there's some things that mattered to me about how I did that. But about the question of the historical record, most of the record that we have of people who were born female and lived as men comes from people who were discovered. And often it happened in a lot of different ways. Sometimes a discovery would be in death. Sometimes a discovery would be, a lover would, be angry at the person and would expose them. There are many, many ways in which discovery happened. But as with any record of, criminal record, trial records and court records of so on, you have to assume that there are going to be actually many, many, many more people who are doing that same thing and never got caught, never were discovered, never counted towards the record. And so I was really interested in creating a character for whom that might be true. I wasn't interested in having Tom's body be discovered, except that it is in an important scene in the novel, a very pivotal, crucial scene. It is. But that wasn't my primary interest, or I didn't want that either to be something that was part of the climax or the end of the book. So there's tons of evidence. Many, many people born female dressed as male to just travel between towns. You could do that, and you couldn't do that as easily as a woman, certainly not by yourself. And so that was super common. Doing it to join the Army or the Navy was also really common. Sometimes it was to follow a lover who was in the Army or the Navy. It could have been for many other reasons that we don't know about. Another thing that I loved about the 17th century, it's kind of the era of pamphlet literature. So there are all these little chapbooks of, like 20-page little books that were printed, and chapmen would carry them from town to town and sell them. And there's one called Hic Mulier, or the Man-Woman, and it warns against what it calls a cultish disease of women adopting masculine garb. These are often women with more money and power who would wear a sword and wear a man's cap with a feather in it. There were sartorial laws that dictated who could wear what, and that affected certain things. But this pamphlet tells us that there were women who kind of half cross-dressed. They'd still wear skirts, but they'd also wear like a doublet and carry a sword and that sort of thing. So that to me was also really interesting, that this pamphlet excoriating the practice is evidence that it happened.
This is all so fascinating to me because I feel like in contemporary discussions of gender, sometimes people who want to sort of advocate for gender as a binary system and a system where you are born as one thing and you stay that thing for the rest of your life will often make the argument that gender fluidity is something that is a product of modernity, basically, that we had the Industrial Revolution and now everyone has time to be gay and trans is actually often how I see the argument go. And it's interesting hearing about this almost moral panic that you're describing in the form of this pamphlet of like, you need to beware of these women who wear doublets and carry swords, that this was something that people needed to be very concerned about. Do you have any thoughts on the practice of trying to read contemporary identity back onto some of these people? Because I've definitely found it to be a bit fraught to try and go back and look at some of these women, as you say, and be like, well, that's a lesbian or that's a trans man, or no, that's a woman who just wanted to be free. It's hard to know. Yeah.
It's something that's been really interesting to me. Like I came out in the early 1980s. So my kind of early encounters in the historical record with women who lived as men, let's call that for shorthand, although I don't know that that's the right language. I actually think it's not, was the discourse at the time gave me the ideas and words to think, well, they were lesbians. They were masculine women who, actualized themselves in this way. And the discourse, in the 40 years since then has changed. And so our ways of conceptualizing people in the past has also changed. When you were asking about, the likelihood of Tom's existing and passing and living as male has for me a contemporary experience for myself that what I often see is that when people see me, they gender me immediately. And often they gender me male. And it's been really interesting to me to see the times when I will provide evidence that might suggest that they could, readjust their assumptions. And they'll just they'll have been so convinced by that first gendering that there's no other way to it. For instance, the name Anne. So I've been at banks many times. I hand over my bank card and they'll say, oh, Anne, that's a funny name for a guy. And I'll, say, yeah, my parents had a sense of humor. And I felt like that's something that I think that especially when you have these sartorial laws about who can wear what, that people would absolutely see someone dressed in men's clothing and have no question whatsoever that that's a man. Also because we, as humans, we know that there are biologically male people with high voices, and we know there are biologically male people with large hips. So we know that there's this biological variation within sexes and genders. So we allow for a wider range at the same time that people are policing the range.
There's this sense of like investigation and certain people needing to get to the bottom of what everyone's gender is, right?
Yeah, as if there exists some secret truth. Which the instance of Tom, I don't feel like he's a woman disguised as a man. I think he's something else, but I'm not even 100% sure what that is. But you were going to go somewhere else with that.
No. I mean, I think that was what was so interesting for me, is that I, as a reader, didn't really have an easy way to categorize Tom as a character. And I remember chatting with my producer and struggling. I was going from he to she to they in the same conversation, talking about this character of Tom, because even Tom's identity within the book, when we hear the way that he's speaking about himself, is somewhat fluid, right? Where he sort of acknowledges, well, I was born a girl, but I decided to become a boy when I was on this ship sailing to Virginia, and I've been a man ever since. And I'm different from the other men, but everybody agrees that I'm a man. So isn't that really enough? And it's interesting, for some people that is enough. You know, you were speaking about the sort of unwillingness to receive new information that might counter an initial perception. With Tom, for instance, the fact that, you know, his body is discovered to be not, I'm doing air quotes, anatomically male. He lacks a penis. And this like curate priest figure who comes upon him is just like, well, clearly a witch stole his penis. That's what must have happened. There's no sort of idea that, well, actually a woman could pass for male. It's like these categories have to be so fixed and rigid. I want to ask about the dedication to Curiosities, because I really loved it, and I think it speaks a lot to the conversation we're having. The dedication reads, "To everyone who has experienced the double take, is that a man or a woman? And to the people who love them." I'm wondering if you can tell me a little bit more about that dedication and what went into your thinking of having that be the first thing that the reader encounters.
Yeah, I put a lot of thought into that, actually, and it just felt perfectly right in the sense that really that's the origin of this novel in many ways. Huge number of rivers of other things flowed into it, but it kind of starts with that my own experience of the double take. I talked about the times when people, you know, gender me and then don't adjust anything. But also I experienced a lot of staring, a lot of people like clearly trying to figure out, is that a man or is it a woman? And then the people ask me. So there's also that, like children will often ask, and adults will often ask as well. It's something that probably since I was like, honestly, 7 or 8 years old is I've experienced the double take. So that's a lifelong experience. I know I'm not the only one. And I know that there's, I've made my peace with that. Like, there's part of me that kind of likes it, right? And I don't want to fault anyone who doesn't know, because I'm trying to give masculine cues in the way that I dress and wear my hair and that kind of thing. So I don't want to, suggest that there's a terrible problem with people who don't see fluidity. But by the same token, I'd like to crack it open a little so that gender fluidity is more visible and more just fine and just like unremarkable. But I wanted to give a nod to the many, the thousands and thousands of us who have that experience. And to the people who love them, because it affects those people as well.
So much transformation has happened around the way that as a society we talk about gender in that period of time. Has there been any shift in the sort of frequency with which you experience these kinds of interrogations or the tone of them over time?
That's a great question. I wish I wish now I had cataloged them so that I could give you a scientific rather than an anecdotal answer to that. because I think my comfort, my sense of safety has increased, and that must be related to, broader cultural changes, in the world that we live in, where it's not difficult to come out now. It's not difficult to say my partner and then use she. Whereas, certainly when I was a child, it was completely off my radar, like nothing that I imagined, except that I was aware of the gender issue there. Like that was always there. And that always felt like I was failing at femininity rather than succeeding at masculinity. So that was a deep thing that was difficult. And that I have to say, like, it continues to be the case that, well, yes, there have been changes. It continues to be the case that some people who, see me in a women's bathroom and think that I'm a man get really angry. And even when I say, no, I am a woman, I'm in the right bathroom, some people were like, oh, I'm so sorry. And there's a lovely, honest exchange there. And some people are just really, really angry that I'm transgressing in some way. And it's not just bathrooms. Like I've seen this in other places as well. And so I have to say, like, yes, massive changes, and yet things linger.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that sometimes is difficult with visibility is that visibility also creates the opportunity for some sort of organized backlash, right?
Yeah,
in the sense that if there are people who now are more aware of the concept of gender fluidity, of the concept that there are trans people, and that some people, for instance, who are trans women might be, in women's bathrooms, and that's
Absolutely.
like a thing that everyone's aware of, it then becomes this sort of policing of folks like yourself that are masculine presenting women, of trans women who pass kind of as women to varying degrees, of people that are non-binary and just otherwise like don't look easily categorizable in one box or another. I'm wondering, like, this is a huge question. What do you see as the future of gender and gender fluidity? Like, where do you see us going from this point that we seem to be at right now, where everyone's like very concerned about gender, and we're hearing all these conversations about like whether they're teaching gender ideology to children in schools and things?
Yeah. Well, we're for sure at a cyclical, backlash thing. But at the same time, I think that children and young adults are showing us that to them it's not that big a deal. For instance, I was at the Calgary Writers' Fest a couple weeks ago, and I was doing an event for children for my children's book, The Goat. And I was saying that the main character in that book is called Kid, and she's gendered female in the book. But I was saying to the audience that that book was published in 2017 and written in the 7 years before that. And I was saying to these kids, I think if I were writing it now, I would make Kid non-binary. I would use they, them pronouns for Kid, because I think that's what Kid would want. And the kids, it's like 60, 70 kids in a room cheered. They thought that was amazing, and of course. And this is like a broad swath of children from public schools in Calgary, and where there have been big issues, right, in Alberta. So I think that's the evidence that those kids are not going to be super freaked out in a bathroom. And actually bathrooms are changing, so there are more gender-neutral bathrooms where, there's stalls and sinks. And we change the notion of fear and of exclusivity and of who's dangerous. We change those together. I think that it's in process now. And I hope that this little backlash is a little backlash that just peters out.
I want to return, Anne, to the title of your novel, Curiosities, and the concept of curiousness, because I feel like for me, this was something that was multi-layered. And as I moved through your work, I found myself realizing there were new ways in which the title felt very apt as a title for this collection of, fake manuscripts that you've crafted. I'm wondering what curiosity means for you in the context of this work and in the context of your life.
Oh, wow. Great question. Yeah. So it was a driving force behind the book, broadly speaking. And it really seemed to me that there are twin sides to curiosity. There's the driving side, the one that makes you want to know why, that makes you want to find out more. Sometimes it's a lovely sense of wonder, of you're seeing something amazing that you've never seen before, and wow, isn't that great? But there's also kind of a greedy or dangerous side of curiosity that sees something and says, that's weird and I want that. And so one of the things that drew me into the 17th century was learning about collectors of curiosities. Originally, when I was conceiving the novel, I thought that a collector of curiosities would be one of the main characters, and in the end, he's not. But that was one of my paths into the story. And so I'm interested in things that are deemed strange or unusual or curious. And I think that's just an enduring interest I have. I kind of want to take those things and make them less strange. I want to show how things that seem to be outliers are not as much outliers as they first appear.
And I mentioned in the introduction to this interview a couple of tidbits that you've included in your biography on your website. Another fun tidbit that I didn't mention in the introduction, your great-grandfather was once the mayor of Toronto. I was like, also, They used to have a new mayor like every year back then. I found that crazy.
Quite frequent. Yeah, Robert John Fleming.
All right. Well, so much lore that we can find through looking at your website. And I was wondering, if someone were to find these sort of ephemera and documents about the writer Anne Fleming in 4 centuries' time, it would be kind of a little bit like your narrator, Anne Fleming, finding these ephemera from Joan and Tom and these other characters around them. What do you think a reader might understand about who you are and our times from your published work, and what would you want them to understand?
Oh, that's a great question. Really, when I come to write fiction, I make a lot of my decisions based on, that would be funny, and which is funny for this book because there's a lot of death in it. There's plagues, there's witch trials. But I also am really the books that move me most are those in which humor and difficulty are adjacent and intertwined, in fact. And I think that my interest in oddities might show up in my ephemera. Like I have this document on my computers that is just a transcription of biographies of musical saw players that I found on the internet. And it's brilliant. Like one guy is a mortician and he plays the musical saw. It's so good. So I think my ephemera would show my delight in eccentricity and my compassion for people and, feeling like humans are lovable and fallible. And that's at the core of what I'm interested in showing in fiction.
Oh, Anne Fleming, author, ukulele player, former school break-in organizer, and musical saw historian. Thank you so much for joining me today. This was such a joy.
It's been my great pleasure. Thank you.
Anne Fleming is the author of Curiosities, a finalist for the 2024 Giller Prize. This episode was produced by Lisa Matthews. Our senior producer is Jacqueline Kirk, and our executive producer is Aaron Balser. I also want to shout out our audio techs and the wider CBC Books team for everything they do to make sure this show gets to air every week. I'm Mattea Roach, and this is Bookends. You can tune in on Sundays and Wednesdays on CBC Radio, or you can follow the show on the podcast app of your choice. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Because when the book ends, the conversation begins.